Thank you very much. As the president of the Center for American Progress, I would also want to thank our partners, MGM, UNLV, the Clean Energy Project, and of course, Senator Reid, who has really been the vision behind this joint effort for 6 years. It's true, a lot has changed over the last 6 years, but some things have stayed the same, and Senator Reid's focus on Nevada and the country being able to take advantage of progress on clean energy through the creation of new jobs while addressing our country and world's greatest challenges is something that's been particularly steadfast. We have a limited time, so I am going to really just dive into questions. I will just say that CAP has been working on these issues for quite a while now, and we've had great partnerships in the federal government around these issues. And we've been really excited by the president's work on the Climate Action Plan. So I will start it off with you, Secretary Moniz. Your department is at the center of the President's Climate Action Plan in a variety of facets, but one critical facet is efficiency. So I think you've been taking some steps on that issue, and we'd love for you to tell us about it.
Well, thank you, Neera. And also, if I may first thank you and CAP and all the sponsors, and especially Senator Reid, who I can assure you makes my job a lot easier from his position and his leadership on these questions. So the President's Action Plan, let me just mention, first of all, two big features, of course, are, number one, what you might call the mitigation agenda, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, efficiency, and supply side, and we can come back to that. But then secondly, the issue around preparing for the consequences of climate change. Senator Reid mentioned things like extreme weather events, and that's also a major focus. Now, on your question specifically on efficiency, I think we committed right from the beginning that we would be aggressive in getting out efficiency standards, and in fact, pleased to say that we committed to having 3 proposed rules out this month, and about 1 hour ago, we signed the first of those proposed rules, halide metal light fixtures. We'll have 2 more out this month. We'll have electric motors out in November, all proposed rules. Not to mention our final microwave rule, which we published last month. So this efficiency agenda, appliance standards, better buildings challenge will be an extremely important focus. I'll just say anecdotally that within 1.5 hours of my swearing in, I spoke at the Alliance to Save Energy, and that was not accidental. It was a focus on the commitment in this area, which the President then gave us huge impetus for through his focus on that in the Climate Action Plan.
Great, John. I wanted to ask you, just to follow up on that and to build a little bit on it. You know, I think people lose sight of the fact that there has been so much change in this arena, that we've actually doubled our use of wind and solar in the last few years, and that there's a lot that's happening in the energy market that's transforming it. What do you see happening in that market? What are the transformative changes, and how much does, just to make it a double question, how much does efficiency play a role as well?
Well, thank you, Neera, and I also want to thank the sponsors and Senator Reid as well for this conference. I guess this is the 6th conference we've had here, and it's been very successful, and I'm very, very pleased to participate. But with respect to markets, I mean, Ernie's agency has, done very well with respect to standards, as he's talked about, and also they do a lot with respect to loan guarantees and grants and basic research. And our agency is an economic regulator, so we are really all about markets. And in those markets, we're very concerned about how to ensure that the markets can embrace all of these new technologies, such as energy efficiency and other distributed resources, demand response, and distributed generation. So what we've done is we've put in place a number of rules that have recognized the value of those types of resources and ensured that those values can be revealed in the markets and that they can be compensated. And if we can do that and make those markets work correctly, I think we can really get to the goals that we need to get to.
May I just add a comment to that,
Yeah.
Neera? Just to say that I think everyone here probably knows, but it's worth repeating that John has brought an incredible focus at FERC on this question of integrating renewables, of looking at the transmission system of the future, smart grids, and I think our efforts are so complementary on that. As a department, going back to the President's Climate Action Plan, of course, we have done a lot to try to get renewables out there. In fact, in this state, 6 loan guarantees, 4 in geothermal, 1 in CSP, and 1 on the grid project that was mentioned earlier. And I think with John's push at FERC, this all comes together to see real progress on the ground.
Great. I'd love to follow up on that. Just given your experience, your prior experience and current experience as a scientist, and now as a new cabinet secretary, how do you see renewables in the future? There are obvious pressure on renewables from natural gas, other issues, but are you optimistic? What's your sense? And do you see this as the potential that many of us have for quite some time?
Well, I'm very optimistic, and the optimism is not grounded in pure fancy. It's grounded in what's happened. Renewables and associated technologies.
Right.
If you look at just in the last 5 years, look at the cost reductions in photovoltaic. Look at the cost reductions and deployment increases in wind. Wind, in fact, has now become the largest new capacity in the country. Look at the cost reduction of LEDs. Look at the cost reduction of batteries for transportation vehicles. Now, on the latter, if you go to wind, certainly in good wind areas, we're already talking, 6 cents a kilowatt hour kind of levelized costs. Solar, in many situations, is becoming competitive. LEDs, terrific life cycle cost benefit right now. Batteries for automobiles, we're still in the position because of cost of not addressing the mass market, but the first half of this year saw twice as many plug-in hybrids bought as last year. We're on track for 100,000 vehicles per year. In fact, many have expressed enormous skepticism around the goal of 1 million electric vehicles by the end of 2015. Well, if we sustain the current growth rate, and it's an if, but if we do, okay, it's April of 2016. So, the idea that these are always the technologies of 10 years from now, I think if you look up at what's happening in terms of utility business model examination, they are seeing the train coming of lots of deployment of these technologies.
And if I could jump in on that,
please.
Neera, it really, as Ernie says, it's not fancy by any means. I mean, when we look at the worldwide market for wind and solar PV, we're talking about a $250 billion market worldwide last year. And if we look, at the growth rates we're seeing continuing, it's going to be a $500 billion market very soon. So it's real. Prices are coming down. That's absolutely true. The city of Palo Alto had a solar contract for 6.9 cents. So we're seeing, unprecedented costs, and it really is because the market is driving these prices down. And the more that we can ensure that these technologies don't have barriers to getting into the market, the more the market will make them work.
And Chairman Wellinghoff, just to build on that point, you've talked a lot about the role of the consumer in creating that demand for renewables. And what Secretary Moniz is describing is that there is a consumer demand for these products. There's a consumer, as he so elegantly said, there's been a lot of skepticism about a demand for plug-in vehicles, and we're seeing that demand. In terms of transmission grid and renewables, from the consumer level, what are you seeing, and how can we actually develop technologies to make that demand even more forceful?
Well, we're seeing demand, for example, in solar PV on a distributed level to a very high degree of incremental increases in installations of 40% or more overall. And those kinds of very high levels are driving a lot of distribution investment to ensure that we can have better voltage control and better stability and better reliability. And we're also seeing consumers that are putting on those systems not only to control their bills, but for overall control of their system and reliability. You can look at the people that were in the middle of Hurricane Sandy, and they're very interested in putting in their own system that can control, their destiny when they have that kind of an event, a huge, climactic event happening. So what we need to do, though, is we need to enable more technologies to have the costs, the balance of system costs come down, and also put in place things that can reduce the permitting costs. And I know that, Ernie's been working a lot on this, and DOE's got a whole Sunshot program that part of this is to really drive down those balance of system costs. And if we can continue to do that, again, the markets can work the way they're intended to, and consumers can have the choice to have those kinds of distributed resources that they're seeking.
And just to go back to the beginning, go ahead.
Let me just amplify a little bit on John's comment. As I said earlier, things like solar costs, wind, EVs really coming down, but there are, in all of those cases, some system challenges that we need to address in terms of grids, in terms of managing distributed generation, et cetera. And so these become critical issues where I think, again, the cost reduction is critical, but it has to go hand in hand with the kinds of regulatory and statutory actions at both the federal and the state levels. And I think that's how we work together. And the other comment I'll make, again, just to amplify John's point, you take something like Sandy and the recovery from Hurricane Sandy, the department is supporting of course, the federal initiative led by HUD. And there, the discussion is really intensely looking at things like, how do we rebuild smart? How do we rebuild with resiliency? And part of the solution we're coming to, of course, is things like microgrids embedded at critical issues in the overall infrastructure.
Just on that particular issue that Chairman Wellinghoff raised around technology and driving efficiency, are you similarly seeing that capability that individual consumers can have more power over their use of electricity in ways that will help drive down costs? And are there ways we can basically enhance consumers to make the right choices, their power to make the right choices?
Correct. In fact, one of the programs funded by the Recovery Act out of DOE was, in fact, about a $4.5 billion program to get out smart infrastructure, both at the transmission side and at the consumer side. In the former, for example, beginning to deploy so-called phasers on the system to get much more early warning about what might be problems developing in the grid, and John could probably amplify on that. And on the consumer side, getting the smart meter infrastructure out there that will permit consumers ultimately to have the right choices. Again, that will be linked very much, especially to state regulatory structures.
And you're right, again, and what Ernie's talking about is really increasing visibility out there with these units, the PMUs, phase monitoring units that DOE is funded to put on throughout the country on the high voltage transmission system that allows us to have much more reliable and resilient grid. And so we're amplifying that, and we're also trying to put in more sophisticated software to be able to look down deeper into the grid to see the resources in the grid. And then we're looking at consumers on the bottom level to have those consumers be enabled to actually participate in grid programs, to be able to provide services to the grid like demand response, energy and capacity, and regulation services as well. And all these types of services can be provided by consumers' loads, by modulating those loads and allowing them to have the communication and control to utilize those as a resource so they can actually receive money for those. I mean, things like, controlling your own thermostat and doing things remotely that can be done that I do at my own home are now enabling consumers to really start controlling their costs in ways that they could never do before.
And let me just add, again, one other thing, linking this back again to the resiliency. I think we talked about smart meters and the infrastructure and allowing all of these services as we go forward, but I think one of the largely unanticipated consequences of this program of getting smart meters out is utilities, Pepco and others, have found that those smart meters have allowed them to dramatically reduce the response time in getting people back up after outages. And simply it's because the utility knows much quicker exactly where to pinpoint where the problems are. We published a report yesterday in collaboration with the Council of Economic Advisors that pointed out the last 2 years, 2011 and 2012, both broke the record for the number of billion-dollar weather-related outages. So this is a big issue, and this is another benefit of having a smarter system.
Right. CAP has done work on actually how much the costs have been for these weather-related events to the federal government, to the country, and they dwarf the amount of investment we've made in kind of getting ready, adapting to the climate events.
And I might say the CAP report led the way in getting those costs out there.
Thank you so much. On that issue, though, just stepping back, going back to the President's Climate Action Plan and the Department of Energy's role in it, you talked a little bit about efficiency. Where is the department writ large? How are you implementing the President's plan, and how do you see the country's response to it? Are there things that we should know about the Climate Action Plan and how it's rolling out?
Well, okay, so as you said, Neera, we've talked about the demand side, efficiency, talked a little bit on the supply side with renewables, but maybe the other thing to emphasize with regard to the President's plan is that it really is the so-called all of the above energy strategy. And let me give you at least my version of what that means, because look, let's be honest. We know there's lots of discussion about the so-called war on coal, and I've said very clearly there is no war on coal. Where do we start from? We start from the fact it's a given. We need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Now the question is, what do we do at the Department of Energy, or what do we do more broadly in the government to enable all of the above to be competitive in that future low-carbon marketplace? That's the test of all of the above. And so if you take coal, just to focus on that one example, this administration has made unprecedented investments, $6 billion, in going beyond the previous talking the talk to walking the talk in terms of demonstrating the science, the technology, and informing the regulation on how carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration can happen. So that's what it means to be all of the above. It's to push forward on the programs that will allow all of these energy sources a competitive option in a low-carbon marketplace.
Great. And what do you see as FERC's role going forward in reducing the big challenge of greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, FERC is clearly resource neutral. I mean, our charge under the Federal Power Act is to ensure that rates are just and reasonable and that these markets operate effectively. What I see FERC's role as being, as I began my discussion here, lowering the barriers to all of these new emerging technologies that previously were not known and did not have constituencies to ensure that they could participate in the markets. Because truthfully, our markets were made up for a very different system than we're moving to. Our markets were made up for a very centralized system, very large plants, and plants that were distant from load. We're now seeing a much more distributed system, a system that not only has distributed generation, but also has consumers participating as resources with their load. So that very different system has to, in fact, incorporate that into the market structure. And I really see that as FERC's primary role, is to ensure that all those resources, all those elements can get a fair opportunity to participate and have whatever values they have fully revealed and compensated when they participate in that market.
I mean, many people have described that as moving from sort of a 19th century model to a 21st century model, from big systems to a more atomized system. How do you move towards that, a new system, without really preferencing one form or another.
Well, first I want to make it clear that we're not moving towards it. We're just responding to it. It's the market that's driving it. It's consumers' demand for a more decentralized, distributed system that they have more control over. We just need to respond to these new technologies in the market to ensure that they're not disadvantaged, because they, in fact, are showing up. And because they're showing up, we don't want them shut out. We want to make sure they have an opportunity to play. So it's not that we're picking winners and losers.
Right.
We're absolutely not doing that. We're letting the market, in fact, make those choices. But the choices have to be made in a fair and open market that recognize the unique characteristics of all the different types of resources. You can't treat a coal plant the same way you treat a wind farm, the same way you treat a solar PV system on somebody's house. They're all different. They all have different characteristics, both technically, financially, and from a regulatory standpoint. So you have to ensure that they all have the ability to participate fairly into that market process.
I'd just like to add a point, because John has this strong emphasis on the marketplace drivers, and in that context, I agree. If you want to know where we're going, watch what's happening out there in terms of business decisions that are being made. And in that context, I'll just note, I'm sure many of you are aware, there is the beginning, at least, let's say, of some tension between distributed renewable resources and conventional utility business models. So as the utility, so one talks about the grid of the past versus the grid of the future, one can also talk about the utility model of the past and the utility model of the future. And they are seeing, as distributed resources come in, as efficiency takes hold, as overall demand is not in a growth mode in the United States, that we don't know the resolution yet, but we know we are at the beginning. We are in the midst of a change, and that's recognized in the business sphere as well as in the kinds of drivers that we have in technology or in regulation.
And I would just add and agree with her either that we really do have to help consumers through that transition, because it is going to be a transition that is going to be bumpy, because we have a traditional utility model that is trying to fit with this new transition that consumers are moving toward a more distributed system, and it has implications for rate design, has implications for costs for both consumers and the utilities and for the utilities business models. So what we want to ultimately ensure is that as we go through this transition, the consumers still have reliable, affordable power.
Right.
I think we have to help consumers and utilities.
I wanted to actually return, Secretary Moniz, you referenced carbon capture and sequestration issues. As you see that model, who do you think, who should be paying for that research, and how can we actually, are you seeing utilities, are you seeing power companies embrace it or resist it?
Well, when it comes to carbon capture and sequestration, and I'll leave utilization aside for the moment, although we can return to that, but in terms of CCS, it's clear that today we don't have the markets, the market signal, if you like. So I think today there is no question that we need federal engagement in public-private partnerships. We have that. Currently, much of it using almost $3 billion of Recovery Act funding. We currently have 8 large projects out there. One is operating, 2 will operate next year. I'm sorry, I should have said, these are carbon capture and sequestration projects at scale, some involving coal power plants, some involving industrial facilities like big ethanol plants. Again, 8 of them are out there. 6 of them, and the Department of Energy is in all cases helping cost sharing those projects. 6 of them also will entail enhanced oil recovery with the carbon dioxide. That will help pay down the cost of CCS. As an aside, it's not well known that today we are already in this country producing 300,000 barrels of oil per day using carbon dioxide enhanced oil recovery. And the estimates are that could go up by a factor of 10. The bottleneck is there's not enough CO2 available. That's where the carbon capture can come in from power plants or industrial facilities. If we execute this program, and again, we've put in $6 billion in CCS, over this decade, not only will we demonstrate the science of sequestration, in parallel, drive down the cost of capture. We have many ARPA-E programs doing that, but also lay the basis for the regulatory structure that we will need at both the federal and the state levels that will allow private companies, when the market signal is there, to do commercial projects of CCS.
And if I could just stay with you and move to the broader issue of sort of clean energy and American competitiveness. As Chairman Wellinghoff pointed out, the market for clean energy, renewables worldwide is dramatically increasing and kind of growing at a fast clip every year. Much has been made about the global competition in this sphere, China's investments, Germany's investments. How do you see American investments in this space, and how do you see this opportunity? And what are your thoughts about whether, if we lose this opportunity, what would, of really capturing a good share of this market, what would that mean for American competitiveness over the long term?
Well, I certainly agree with your inference that we need to move out right now, and that's part of why we have these deployment programs. Maybe I'll come back to that. As you say, look, the fundamental issue is the global markets are forming rapidly, and we got to be at the front of the train and not the caboose if we want to be a major player. Now, I think we need to. In my view, there is no question, we remain the leader in innovation in these technologies. We also have to capture the supply chain benefits there. Now, in some cases, it will be with manufacturing here in the United States with domestic supply. Sometimes, actually this morning, for example, I went by in the convention hall the Extreme Green booth, a company here in Las Vegas with electric specialty vehicles. Manufactured here, most of the supply chain here, but not 100%. But that's the way the global market's going to work, and we need to capture that now kind of across the board. I mentioned in terms of trying to stimulate that, and one of the favorite subjects is always the loan guarantee program at the Department of Energy. But again, my view is, what's there to be defensive about? A $35 billion portfolio with 2% current and projected defaults in it, with many, many, many success stories. That's what it means to have a portfolio out there. So I think this is really, again, it's establishing very, very large renewable projects, major vehicle projects, stimulating the first nuclear power construction in the United States. So it's really, again, and all of the above, let's get out there and get these technologies on the ground.
Just on that point, people lose sight of the fact that for venture capital, as you know, private sector venture capital, it's a 40% failure rate on average. So 2% sounds even better in comparison. John?
Yes, on that point of our competitiveness worldwide, certainly the Chinese are ahead of us in a number of manufacturers of PV systems, but we have the best PV companies, I think, here in this country, and the most innovative, I think, in many ways. And in addition to that, on the smart grid side, on distributed generation and distributed resources, the innovations I think we've done on the smart grid are far ahead of the Chinese. And I visited the Chinese on a number of occasions, and we have actually MOUs with them. We did a smart grid conference with the Chinese 2 years ago in Shenzhen. Our agency did, and I was quite surprised by how advanced we are as compared to they are with respect to smart meters, for example, and all the other smart grid technologies that we're moving into the field at the distribution level.
Could I add that in addition to the technologies themselves. And certainly the Department of Energy, many may not know that the Department of Energy is the largest supporter of kind of basic science in the physical sciences and key enabling technologies. Just another example, which is not the technology itself, but an enabler of many, many energy and national security activities, very, very large computation. In late May, I visited Oak Ridge National Laboratory and saw the world's fastest supercomputer for the next 3 days before being overtaken by China. But as we look forward, we have always, and the Department of Energy has played a major role in leading the way to the next generation. So now we're talking about going to exascale. This is going to be a 10-year effort where real breakthroughs are needed. For example, energy efficiency reductions, advances by a factor of 10 required to make this practical. But this cuts across the board in terms of what's happening in industry, in terms of using these new tools to design many, many energy technologies, and central to our national security. This is a case where, for national security reasons, we need to have American technology there. So that's going to be a big push for the next 10 years, the next factor of 1,000 in computation.
And just as we begin to close the panel, I wanted to ask you, Chairman Wellinghoff, you're an outgoing chairman. What have you been most surprised by? What are you most optimistic about the American market? And do you have any thoughts for us?
Well, I'd say I'm most optimistic about the fact that people are embracing markets, and we've talked about the senator in his opening remarks talked about Mid-America, who is going to be acquiring NV Energy, and Mid-America owns another company in the West called Pacificor. Pacificor is going to join a market. They're going to actually join with the Cal ISO and do what's called an energy imbalance market, which is a step towards moving to a more robust market structure. In the East as well, we're seeing companies like Entergy, for example, a utility in the Southeast, that's now going to join a market in the Midwest. So we're seeing people starting to understand the value of markets, and from that, I think, respond to them, and even down at the retail level. Myself, I'm in Washington, D.C., and I have retail choice there. I actually take my electricity from Washington Gas, and I think people are starting to understand. It's something that was, foreign to them before because they just had one provider, but people are starting to understand if they have multiple providers, multiple choice, multiple options, that they will respond to it, and that's the thing I'm most optimistic about.
Great. And you've actually been a cabinet secretary for just a few months.
10 weeks. In contrast, I might add to, I believe, John being the longest serving FERC chairman, for which we congratulate him, and I might.
You're not the shortest serving cabinet secretary so far.
No, that's right.
There's some that came after you.
But I want to add also, in my previous life at MIT, John would come up at least once a year to give a talk, and it was incredibly informative to our students and faculty, and so he's been just a terrific contributor.
And do you have some thoughts for us on what you see happening over the next 4 years as your tenure as cabinet secretary?
Well, clearly, on the energy front, our task, our job, and a pleasant one, is to execute on the President's Climate Action Plan. I should have said, perhaps, that, of course, clearly we have a whole set of responsibilities spelled out in the plan. Again, efficiency, deploying clean technology, of course, at our core, maintaining a broad set of innovative approaches to new technology, taking on the challenges of grid resilience. Clearly, the President has said, and we are going to have a very, very strong focus on the grid, and not only on the electric grid, something we did not mention, but also on the increasingly clear need to look at the independencies of different infrastructures.
Right.
Again, if you go back to Sandy, one of the really, let's face it, not previously thought through issues was how the electricity grid going down, for example, took down a lot of your fuels infrastructure,
Right.
Getting people to move around, et cetera. So that's going to be infrastructure will be a big focus. In fact, in the President's action plan, he laid out a new process that we will execute called a quadrennial energy review, which brings together the equities of agencies across the administration. And for this first QER, the focus will be on energy infrastructure writ broadly.
Great. Thank you both very much for an informative discussion, and thanks for your work on this set of issues. I know there'll be more work in the future. Thank you for your contribution for the country. And thank you, Secretary Moniz, for stepping up and taking on one of the seminal challenges of our time, seminal problems of our time, and we wish you good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.